Voices Call Dialogue, widening your horizons.
Hello, welcome back to Duran ASEAN. You're with Gowri.
And this is Arlene.
And this is our ABC Dialogue for Wednesday morning. And today with us we have a guest from US-Malaysia. Her name is Elina Noor, and she's the Assistant Director of Foreign Policy and Security Studies. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks. So you're from US-Malaysia, not the ISIS.
Correct. Yeah, I just want to point that out.
Right.
We are not affiliated with, or we actually predated the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So we're the Institute of Strategic International Studies.
So when
in
they took
Malaysia.
over that acronym, what was the feeling? It's like, no, that's ours.
Yeah, well, it's not ours really, but there is a lot of confusion, so it's quite unfortunate.
Have you guys thought of coming up with some modifications or something?
No, I mean we had the name first.
So it's a copyright issue there.
I don't know about that, but.
So today we will be looking at the relationship between US and Malaysia, or as our title says, being buddies with Uncle Sam. So maybe Elina, you can give us just a little background to the historical relations of US and Malaysia?
Sure. US and Malaysia, we've been friends for a long, long time, and since Malaysia achieved independence.
What about prior to independence? Were we more towards the British? Were the US present in our diplomatic relations?
Well, we did really have any diplomatic relations per se because we were under colonial rule at the time, but I think personally there were always links with the US, and if you read the stories, Tunku Abdul Rahman is reportedly said to have modeled our flag on the US flag, so there was always sort of that affinity with the US, and I think we sort of always looked at the US in a favorable light. And when we achieved independence, I think that relationship only really strengthened over the years. And we've seen that particularly in the last 5 years or so. But even when our political relationship was fraught with difficulties, particularly during Prime Minister Mahathir's time, functionally and at the operational level, our relationship with the US was always very strong, particularly in the defense and security areas, but also in economics and trade.
Mm-hmm. Talking about trade, so the US have had trade relations and economic interests in Malaya at the time, and also Malaysia after the formation of Federation of Malaysia. What were the interests back then, and the interests now have somehow evolved?
Well, obviously our economy has evolved, and we've come a long way from being just a sort of primary commodity exporter to services exporter now. But our trade over the years has seen some peaks and lows. I think at one point a few years ago we were sort of the US's 18th largest exporting partner. Unfortunately, our trade with the US has taken a slight dip.
Is it because of China?
Well, yes, China is a factor in many economies, and how the economic dynamics of different countries trade. But I think we've also seen, despite the fact that trade between both the United States and Malaysia has dropped a little.
Is it dropped a little just between Malaysia, or like cut across all the Southeast Asian region?
I actually don't know the answer to that, but I would suspect that because of China, among other factors, trade has sort of shifted, right, in priorities from one country to another, including with the United States. But the US and China are very big trading partners as well. Mm-hmm. But coming back to Malaysia, the US remains and has always been one of the top 3 foreign direct investors in Malaysia. So they remain a very strong presence, and you've seen that since they were the first investors in Penang in Malaysia, and they continue to be there. So in terms of investment, there's still a very strong US presence here.
Mm-hmm. What is the relationship like at the present moment?
I would say that the political relationship is at its best in a long, long time, possibly since independence. As you know, when we had Prime Minister Mahathir in our leadership, there was some political difficulties that we had with the United States over foreign policy issues. But even in those times, as I've said before, the working relationship between our defense, our militaries, between our businessmen, those links were always very strong. But I think the improvement that we've seen really has been at the political side of the relationship over the last 4 or 5 years, especially when Prime Minister Najib and President Obama both sort of took office at around the same time. So there were some good synergies going on there, and I think they've developed a good rapport between them. So there is that personal element to it as well, and they seem to get along well during meetings. So that's enabled our relationship to progress even further.
And going back to what you said about Mahathir earlier, I've also read some articles that said that he had problems with the foreign policy towards US. But do you know what specifically did he have a problem with?
I think many countries have a problem with the way the US conducts its foreign policy in the Middle East in particular. And I think many Americans have a problem with the way their government conducts foreign policy there for various reasons. But, you know, with Mahathir, he championed the Muslim world and its causes. So front and center for him was how the United States has always, no matter what, been a strong supporter of Israel, even when Israel has flouted international law in its face when it comes to the treatment of the Palestinians and their rights. Israel is a belligerent occupant under international law. You know, it's a fact. But the U.S. has always stood by Israel, again, for various and domestic political reasons. And so for Mahathir, and I think that's a theme that's continued through our leadership, whether it's been Mahathir, Patla, or now, you know, Prime Minister Najib, we've always taken a strong stand against how the U.S. deals with the Middle East issue. But also under Mahathir, if you remember, that's when the U.S. invaded Iraq. So it was sort of a continuation of all these grievances, you know, of how the U.S. was conducting its policy in that region.
But at the same time, Mahathir was also wary of the West, especially when it comes to Western influence in domestic politics and all that. Were at that time, did any of the Mahathir's statement made any significant change in terms of the relationship between Malaysia and the U.S.?
That change really was at the political level. So I think, you know, if you could splice up the relationship into different layers, there were essentially 2 layers. So at the political sort of superficial level, the relationship was a bit tense because there were these very open disagreements, particularly from our side. And, you know, Prime Minister Mahathir was voicing them very vociferously at the international level. But at the sort of the under level of the relationship, the base layer where the working level officials were at, that relationship still remained very strong. And I think trade still went on. So
what about security? During Mahathir's time, were there any cooperation or joint ventures between Malaysian government and the US government in terms of security?
Oh, definitely. You know,
especially at the height of 9/11, where terrorism was one of the main concern of US foreign policy.
Exactly. So, you know, the defense relationship between the US and Malaysia had begun early on, like from the Vietnam War. And you saw the security element of that cooperation really kick in, as you said, right after 9/11. So we had a joint agreement between the US and Malaysia on counterterrorism, and the level of collaboration between law enforcement and intelligence agencies in both Malaysia and the US, they really escalated right after that time. But if you remember from media reports right after 9/11, it was our intelligence agencies that actually had warned the intelligence agencies in the United States about people who were behind 9/11. So there was intelligence sharing going on even before 9/11 happened.
Yeah, I still remember. I know this is a popular culture thing, but remember Somalia, the movie Black Hawk Down?
Yes.
I think Malaysia played a major role in that.
That's right.
If you can explain more about it and how it, I mean, even though Mahathir was very much vocal against the US, but when it comes to security and defense, especially when it comes to, issues related to other countries, like the civil wars in Somalia. Like it really strengthened the way we work together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's testament to how strong our Malaysia-US relationship has been, because we lost lives trying to save American lives in that marketplace in Bakara, Somalia that day. And we've seen the US version of events, Black Hawk Down, but I understand that some of our Malaysian producers are coming up with the Malaysian version, talking about the heroism and the sacrifice.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh.
And that's due to come out quite soon, I understand. So, there's a lot of talk and a lot of publicity about American sacrifice, but behind the scenes, we gave our lives too for the Americans, and they appreciated it very, very much. In fact, they expressed their gratitude right after it happened, which is an underlooked fact, especially when the political side is played up and we criticize the Americans and we say they don't give us enough credit. But credit where it's due. They really expressed their gratitude.
What form of cooperation that were happening during the 90s and early 2000 when it comes to terrorism and civil war in other countries, were there any sharing of knowledge in terms of defense training and all that?
Yeah, there have been joint military exercises between our forces for a very long time, again, as I said, dating back to the Vietnam War. Last year, we had something like 75 exercises together, bilateral and multilateral ones in the region. And then we've signed numerous...
The exercises happen in Malaysian shore?
Yes, in Malaysia as well as in other countries on a multilateral level.
But US do not have a base in Malaysia?
That's not to my knowledge. But yes, counterterrorism, absolutely. There has been continued cooperation in that area. We signed a mutual legal assistance treaty to aid in extradition of offenders, criminals and terrorists if there were reason to. We also have various counterterrorism agreements between both governments. So that particular area is very strong.
So in any way that Malaysia is being invaded by terrorists or any enemies of the government, the US can step in to help?
Well, I think our security agencies are quite capable of handling that threat on their own. The US, I'm sure, would provide, intelligence assistance. I don't think they'd actually be sending boots on the ground. We certainly wouldn't allow that.
Yeah, this is in relation to the issues related to the Lahad Datu, where we have a major security concern, and a lot of people were criticizing the way the government handled the whole issue.
Yeah. Yes, well, there were different reasons for that I've heard. But I think, again, our military and our intelligence and police agencies, they're very well equipped to handle these threats.
And back in 2002, there was this Malaysian-US Friendship Council that was set up. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what role it played in strengthening the relationship.
The Friendship Council has taken on various forms over the years. We used to have a Malaysia caucus in the US Congress as well, and that was really to drum up awareness about Malaysia in the legislative arm of the US government. But the Friendship Council is really, again, also to create recognition for Malaysia and appreciation for Malaysia. That form has evolved over the years to take... There is now a Malaysia-America Society in the US. There is also a Malaysia-America Foundation in the US, which works together with the Malaysia-America Society. So together, they try to engage Americans and educate them more about Malaysia, because in Washington, D.C. in particular, where all decisions are made in the US, there isn't very much knowledge about Malaysia. And not just there, but among Americans as well. So it doesn't compare to people's knowledge about, say, Thailand, which is a treaty ally, the Philippines, another treaty ally, or Indonesia, which is the biggest country in this region. So there have been efforts among Malaysia lovers to try and create that awareness.
So is it only done through educating the Americans? Do they send people over, try to have any exchange activities?
Yeah, there have been exchanges. The issue always with any organization is funding, right? So my understanding is that some of the programs the Malaysia America Foundation has planned includes things like more exchanges between young people in particular and civil society. But again, you need to find the money for that. So hopefully,
in fact, the U.S. Embassy also done a lot of initiative when it comes to education, and they also have the Macy Center,
right,
that focuses on specifically on American education and also the local education, and they also have this thing called ETA.
ETA, yes.
Teaching assistants.
Yes.
Yeah.
That program actually has expanded over the years because there's been such a demand for it from our side. And of course, the teachers there, they have a wonderful experience with the kampung kids and all. It's a completely different experience from what they would have at home. And they take this with them for years to come. So, 50, 60 years from now, they'll still, if they're still alive, remember the times that they shared with these little kids. And that's an area actually that we're trying to expand cooperation in our bilateral relations, because the traditional anchors of our relationship, defense, security, economics, and trade, those are pretty grounded.
Yeah,
right?
And
so
one.
yeah.
So this is more like on the soft power of the U.S.
Right.
So having education is one of it. But what kind of messaging that the American government is trying to put on when it comes to education?
I think the education part is really a demand from our side. So they're responding to our demands. And I don't think there is any overt, there might be subtle intentions to, spread their messaging or convey their messages.
But it is also because during Bush era, the soft power of America was rather tainted, especially in the majority of the Muslim world. A lot of Malays, especially if you're talking about Malaysia, in the Malaysian context, they are very skeptical of Western power, especially the US.
Right.
Has activities like the ETA somehow strengthened the image of the US in the Muslim world?
It's going to take a long time, and I think there are some people who are not going to change their minds regardless. So yes, soft power it's one of those things where it's always going to be eclipsed by the hard realist explosions that go on in the Middle East, right, aided by American weaponry. So that image is always, unfortunately for the Americans, going to be in the back of a lot of minds in our country. But they could always mitigate the effect of that with things like the ETA at our request.
Maybe we can move on to the South China Sea.
Okay.
And since that's been quite a controversy of recent, and U.S. has been warned this morning, was it yesterday, not to meddle in the South China Sea issue. But like you said, Vietnam is an ally, a treaty ally of the U.S. So how does this whole thing play out here?
So Vietnam is very interesting because if you remember the Vietnam War, it was basically the Americans against the Vietnamese. But the Vietnamese-American relationship has really taken off in recent years. Vietnam is not a treaty ally of the U.S. Yet, but I don't know if they ever will be. The Philippines is. And
in fact, the Philippines has signed a 10-year agreement to extend the U.S. military base in the area itself.
Yes. So there's always been sort of this internal debate in the Philippines about how much they want the Americans in and on their soil. But now with the South China Sea cropping up, I think we see more demand from the Filipino side for U.S. support. And I think, to be honest, the U.S. is in a bit of a quandary about this because they're treaty allies, but they don't want to get drawn into, a hot conflict with China.
I have a view on this. If the U.S. is meddling too much, especially in some of its allies, on the issue regarding on South China Sea, this will only weaken ASEAN itself, because the allegiance of a lot of the countries within Southeast Asia towards the superpower of China and U.S. is divided. There are certain countries like Cambodia, they are much more pro-China, and also Myanmar, and there are certain countries like, of course, the Philippines, they are much more pro-US, while Malaysia and Singapore, we are much more like in a neutral position. with superpower meddling into the issue of South China Sea, will this somehow weakens ASEAN itself, because they can't even make a decision to against China when in the last ASEAN summit meetings?
Critics of ASEAN would say that ASEAN has always been weak. But yes, the South China Sea does make it more complicated because it's not all ASEAN countries are claimants, of course, right? And so you have this not division, but there are these layers within ASEAN. So you have countries that are sort of disinterested and maybe swayed by different powers, and then you have countries that are claimants and have different allegiances to different powers. So it makes it very complicated, and the South China Sea is an overlapping, multi-layered territorial dispute. So I think it's a bit unfair to the US to say that they're meddling, because if they do, it is at the request of some of the ASEAN countries themselves.
But the code of conduct was being introduced by the US.
No, actually, it was an ASEAN initiative, the code of conduct, and we being ASEAN tried to get China to sign on, and have been trying to do so. There has been progress in that area. China has indicated that it is willing to move forward with the code of conduct. But again, the criticism is that because ASEAN is so weak, it's not able to really put any teeth to the code of conduct, even if it is eventually realized.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll take a short break for now. We'll be back in a bit to discuss more about US interest in ASEAN.
ASEAN Breakfast Call Dialogue, widening your horizons.
Hello and welcome back to Duran ASEAN. You're still with Gowri
And Arlene.
and
Elina.
yeah. So we're back from our break, and we are going to continue with our discussion about being friends with the US. And
With Uncle Sam.
With Uncle Sam, yeah. And earlier we were discussing about US interest in ASEAN, how they affect the South China Sea and all. So going back to that, what is US interest in ASEAN? Do they want to meddle? Do they want to keep out of it?
Especially with the U.S. rebalance under President Obama, I think the U.S. has really come to realize that it is a Pacific power, as President Obama has said, and they want to be more involved in this region, with ASEAN as sort of the pivotal point in the relationship, if you'll excuse the pun. But ASEAN, I think, has always been seen as important in the U.S. It's just that they've been distracted by, things like Iraq, Afghanistan, the Middle East. There's always something going on there, right? And so they've decided this time around to really shift their focus on a region that's growing very fast. And so their interests align with ours. In a sense, we've always been wanting for them to be in this region. When Condoleezza Rice didn't attend some ERF meetings, we made a big deal out of it. All right. And then when they say that they're back in this region, then we complain about them meddling. So it's a little difficult for them sometimes, I think. But in essence, ASEAN countries want strong U.S. presence in this region. And we've always wanted that because it helps with the stability and the prosperity of the region in the same way that the presence of other major powers in this neighborhood does.
Is that the reason why ASEAN wants to counterbalance China in a way? Because China's power is growing, as we all know that it's growing not just in terms of economy and all that, but also in terms of its territory in maritime. So, and I'm referring to the South China Sea, of course.
Yes.
So how does the immediate countries like Vietnam and Philippines, how do they ensure that they will always be protected by another by either ASEAN or the US?
Yeah, I think you see this power play evolving, particularly in the South China Sea, as you pointed out. Yes, China is claiming a huge territory, maritime territory, including, our waters. But it's particularly difficult for the Philippines and Vietnam because they are geographically closer to China, and that's why there have been all these sort of mini skirmishes in that area. For us, we're a little further, so there hasn't been any real tension for now, at least. And so you see this closer alignment between Vietnam and the US, which is a little bizarre if you think about their history. And the Philippines, naturally, because of their treaty alliance and the history with the US, they've been turning more to the US, primarily because they need the support of a bigger brother because of their lack of capacity to deal with China.
But Vietnam is an interesting example, because in the past, Vietnam has been a communist country, has always been aligned with the Soviet, but now, since it's opening up, it has somehow embraced the US, which is an irony.
Yeah, it's really quite amazing to see how they've come full circle. And the US, in return, is also really opening up to Vietnam. And I think it sees Vietnam's potential in its development, but also it embraces this sort of warming of the relationship, particularly with what's going on with China in the South China Sea.
Mm-hmm. What about in terms of trade with ASEAN? As we all know, when it comes to free trade agreement, if we are talking in terms of the Malaysian context, it has gone back even before the TPPA, where there were rounds of talks to somehow court Malaysia into this. But what happened?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that you use the word court because, as I was talking to you earlier, the analogy that I've heard with the Malaysia-US free trade agreement talks is that for a long time, it was like 4 years of dating, essentially, right, is the analogy that's used. The Malaysia and the US were on these dates. There were like 16 rounds of dates, of talks, right?
That's a long time to court
Very long courtship, yeah, and then it fizzled out, all right? And so now I think both the Malaysia and the US are trying for a slightly different take on this courtship and taking it to a multilateral level.
So it's the next level now.
It's supposed to be the next level to the relationship, trying to work out our issues over the 4 years, and we sort of reached some sort of a better understanding between ourselves. So we're going to take that to the next level.
But when you talk about TPP, of course, in the Malaysian context, there is a lot of either you agree or disagree, or you're in the know of it.
Right.
But when it comes to the ASEAN level, even countries like Vietnam is part of the TPP, which is an irony as well.
Yes, that's true.
So what is your observation when it comes to US trade with Southeast Asia? It seems like US is somehow pushing for its presence in this region.
You know, the TPP, when it originally started, didn't include the US. And then the US figured it needed a real trade policy in this region, and that's why it joined, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the 4th round of the TPPA talks.
The TPPA talks started in
early 2000s, yes. I think with the sort of paralysis of what was going on in the WTO, so then the US turned its attention.
But in the beginning, it wasn't such a big deal, because when you talk about free trade, every country has somehow a free trade with another country. Even ASEAN itself is opening up for free trade,
right?
Post-ASEAN community soon. But why the TPP has become such a hot-bedded topic?
It's supposed to be this unprecedented multilateral partnership agreement that takes free trade arrangements to a place that's it hasn't ever been before. And so that's what's scary to a lot of the negotiating parties, because the TPP includes things like intellectual property, which is sort of anti-trade if you think about it, labor, environment. These are things that are traditionally not really, the fundamentals of a free trade agreement that are discussed. And so it requires a lot of changes in the domestic policies of the negotiating partners. And that's why it has met with so much resistance in all of the negotiating countries, including the US. And as you said, you're either for the TPP or, as in the case of many countries, you're against the TPP, especially if you're in the civil society.
Moving on to the crisis in Israel and Palestine. As we all know, US is pretty much for Israel, and Malaysia we are very obvious our stand. We are very pretty much vocal against Israel. And how does Malaysia feel about this?
Malaysia's stand is, I think this cuts across race and religion, because a lot of us see it as a Muslim issue, and it's not. It's a humanitarian issue, what's going on in Palestine. And this cuts across, whether you're Malay, Chinese, Indian, Sikh, Christian, whatever. And there are even Jewish people in the US and Israel that feel very strongly about what's going on in Palestine. And our stand has always been very clear. Because this is a humanitarian issue and because Israel has consistently flouted international law and UN Security Council resolutions over the years, there needs to be an honest broker when it comes to negotiating peace in the Middle East. And there needs to be a restoration of international law in order for peace to actually take root. And I think Prime Minister Mahathir, he was very, very, as he pointed out, very vocal about how he felt about this. And our stand has been consistent throughout. We haven't been as vocal as Mahathir over the years.
Israel is a strong ally of the US. They even receive funding from the US. But at the same time, US is proposing, it has been quite some time already, they're proposing for the two-state solution.
Yes.
Has Malaysia endorsed that proposal?
I think in recent times, the realization is, yes, there has to be a two-state solution. And I'm not sure if we've come up with an official statement about that, but there have been sort of informal comments on that. And I think at this point in time, unfortunately, the right to return for the Palestinians is becoming more and more of a distant reality, with Israel grabbing land in the West Bank recently, another 1,000 acres for settlement. So it's a new reality that we shouldn't accept, but we have to come to terms with, pragmatically speaking.
I have to talk about McDonald's, I'm sorry.
Let's talk about McDonald's.
Let's talk about McDonald's. As you all know, during the height of the Israel protests, a lot of Malaysians took part in somehow boycotting McDonald's. It's a sign of American presence. It's also a sign of Israel presence somehow. I don't know how it came about, but but how did the US react to this, and what about Malaysian government's reaction towards this?
From what I observed, the reaction was quite muted. I think it was the usual, keep calm and, I don't know, carry on eating McDonald's or something. But I'm being facetious. But I think there are people who feel very strongly about whether boycotts work or not, right? And there are people who obviously feel that the franchises of McDonald's, Starbucks, and these different countries in Malaysia and other countries are somehow directly linked to the Zionist lobby. And I think we have to be very clear about the distinction, because I think in Malaysia we tend to equate all things Israel with all things Jewish and all things Zionist, and that's not always true. As I mentioned, there are Jews in Israel as well who are against what the Zionist lobby wants for Israel. So we have to be very clear in our distinction. And likewise, with boycotts, however you feel about them, I think you need to really think through about whether these things actually have an impact in a direct sense or not.
And what about the US-Malaysia relation? It didn't have any effect on that?
Not really, because this was mainly a civil society initiative, right? And kudos to them for being activist about it. But I think this is testament to how strong the US-Malaysia relationship really is, because and I've heard the relationship being described as a mature friendship. Before we had the US-Malaysia Comprehensive Partnership, right? I was always wondering whether we needed something like that, a formalization of our relationship.
Like a treaty.
Right, but that's never going to take place in Malaysia. But this partnership was sort of the elevation of our relations. And before that partnership, I had asked a few people in the States, do you think we need something like this? And they said not really, because ours is a mature friendship. And it stood the test of times. And if you can criticize each other openly but still continue to be firm friends, I think that's really a mark of mature and steady friendship. But that said, the partnership is really meant to deepen the traditional areas of cooperation, but also widen the areas of collaboration, such as the ones we talked about in education, youth exchanges.
I want to give an example of, if let's say there's a change in the next generation, there's a change of government, as in the opposition becomes the government of Malaysia.
Right.
Will the relationship somehow evolve or change, or would it be the same? Has the U.S. government formed a strong relationship with the opposition as well as the current government, Barisan Nasional?
The U.S. engages with opposition leaders here. And to be honest, I'm not sure what the foreign policy stance of the opposition is towards the United States. We have not heard anything on that area, in that area. But I think the partnership is meant, this comprehensive partnership between Malaysia and the US is meant to institutionalize the links that we already have. So even if there were to be a change of government on our side or on the US side, those links will remain set in stone. And so they'll weather, whatever political changes there will be.
Mm-hmm. In which area in particular that the relationship will remain the same?
Hopefully in the traditional areas, the anchors of our relationship, economics, trade, defense, security, that's really up to the government. But I think increasingly so, we're moving more towards, collaboration in science and technology, in new underexplored areas, youth exchanges, sports is one, culture, education.
Mm-hmm. One of it is NBA basketball.
Yes, it's interesting because there's the ASEAN Basketball League,
Yeah.
And that's sort of, modeled on the NBA among others. So, yeah, we might see more, ex-NBA players in the country, hopefully.
Who knows, right?
So going back to during Mahathir's time, we had a very clear foreign policy.
Mhm.
But how has that changed over the years, especially now? What is our...
Yeah, especially Najib has been somehow condemned as being weak towards the US.
Yes, he's also been criticized for being weak domestically. So unfortunately, the Prime Minister gets a lot of criticisms for his job.
There's a lot of silence. Maybe that's the reason why he's always been criticized as being weak.
Well, I think, from a political perspective, Prime Minister Najib's foreign policy stance towards the US is probably the most welcoming and receptive compared to the other prime ministers, and that's probably one reason for the criticism of him being, pandering to the US, so to speak.
Majority of the criticism that the public has towards Najib when it comes to dealing with the US, what were the issues that they believe that Najib could have been firm?
Yeah, it's strange. I haven't seen any real constructive criticisms or comments on that front. What would be the alternative?
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of the areas that have come under criticism have been, for example, the fact that we sent a medical team to Afghanistan, and that was purportedly at the request of the United States, which is not true. That was at the request of Afghanistan. We've also signed on to the Proliferation Security Initiative recently when President Obama came. And so that's another sign of us, giving in to the US. Malaysia coming to the negotiating table of the TPP is also seen as a sign of us, bowing before the US. And I think, to be honest, if we are intellectually honest, there has to be some recognition of the fact that we do this of our own accord. And, the government has been saying this. We went to the TPP voluntarily, like no one coerced us, and it's actually quite condescending to say that we do all these things to pander to the US.
In fact, the early version of the TPP did not have that many partners. Now
Right.
it has, even Japan is coming in quite recently.
Yeah, so from 4, it's come to 12. Mm-hmm. And the US, they say that what they hope of the TPP is that it will eventually evolve into the free trade agreement of the Asia Pacific, including China. So there's a lot of criticism from Malaysians who say that we shouldn't be in the TPP because it only includes the US and excludes China. Well, China actually has demonstrated interest in joining the TPP.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it has, and it's just it's not ready to join the TPP yet, but it is watching the evolution of the TPP with interest.
So in other way, TPP has evolved from being just a US interest multilateral agreement to if the Chinese join, it will be like a global multilateral agreement.
Well,
would that be the case?
It's supposed to cover eventually, right, the whole of the Asia Pacific. And the TPP and RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, they're meant to actually complement each other towards that goal.
So we're almost running out of time, but in line with Malaysia Day and the recent Merdeka Day, what is your hope for Malaysia? What would be your ideal Malaysia?
You know, we always look to the US as this model of multiculturalism, right? And we often forget that we have that same multiculturalism because we're so caught up with ethnicity, religion, titles. So my wish for Malaysia as it moves forward is for us to really go back and see ourselves for who we are as Malaysians, and to move far beyond just race, religion, or even titles. So we talk a lot about unity, but really that's my wish, that we all realize that there is already unity and we just need to live it.
Right, so with that, we'll wrap up our ABC dialogue for this morning.
Thanks, Elina.
Thank you.